Howdy gamers, and new games are the wish. You spend $60 on them, all for them to end up looking like this. That's dumb, stupid, and a waste of money. I'd rather spend $4 on a game and have it look like this. Now that's gaming. Video games are the best. You spend $60 on them only for you to add it to your giant backlog of games and realize, oh god, I'm never gonna have time to play through all of these. So on second thought, maybe they're not the best, but hey, at least playing them is pretty fun. I mean, you might not like what you play, and now I'm not too sure why I have all of these, but there's a pretty simple way to tell what games you'll like and dislike, judging them off of box arts. Frick, now I have more questions than answers. Let's just stick to judging games based off of genres. And there are so many different genres of video games, with some being pretty niche, like try to explain to your dad what a 4X game is. I mean, I don't even know, but it's still nice to have those genres to be able to tell what games you'll probably end up enjoying, and probably end up disliking. And even though some are pretty niche, some are a lot more well known and self-explanatory. Take for example horror games. It's been a pretty long-lasting genre, with the first horror games coming out in 1981. And I'm not too sure what makes these horror games, but I'll take their word on it. These weren't really too different from other games at the time, maybe with some spooky music if that's what you would call this. Of course, next year in 1982, some pretty groundbreaking stuff happened. We actually got our first movie tie-in horror game, being the Texas Chainsaw Massacre on the Atari. I'm sure if I was a Texas Chainsaw Massacre fan, I'd be eating this up and going, oh yeah, that's the iconic white fence that chases after the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And I would probably go, oh yeah, that's the iconic noise of something. In addition to being the first questionable horror movie tie-in game, we also got the first horror arcade game, being Monster Bash, made by Sega. This one you can actually tell why it's a horror game, because they have classic horror movie monsters like Dracula, Frankenstein, and everyone's favorite, Chameleon Man. You don't play as them though, you play as Bashman, and your goal is to light the 4 candles while running away from insert monster here. I mean, it was a lot better than what Malcolm Evans was doing at the time with 3D Monster Maze. That's supposed to be a dinosaur. Really though, that ends the first generation of horror games, because there's only so much you can do with systems that can't even run Pac-Man correctly. But with the second generation of consoles, we had the NES and Sega Master System. I refuse to look at anything else, they are not real. This generation though, we didn't really get as many horror games, especially when compared to the Atari and ColecoVision. For the first year of the NES's life, there were no horror games for it. We wouldn't get our first one until 1986, which was Castlevania. It definitely wouldn't be considered a horror game nowadays, but I mean, sure, it was better than 3D Monster Maze at least. The game was made by Konami, and a year later, in 1987, it was released in America. But going back to 1986, we also got Monster House for the Sega Master System. This was loosely based on their horror arcade game that they had made earlier, but to my disappointment, this is not at all based on the 2006 movie. Although I guess I shouldn't be surprised since this game came out in 1986. In 1987 though, in addition to Castlevania coming to America, the sequel came out in Japan, and Lucasfilms also published their first game, a horror game called Maniac Mansion. It's an adventure horror game where you enter Maniac Mansion and try and save your girlfriend from a mad scientist. And if that name sounds familiar, that's because it's the prequel to Day of the Tentacle, a non-horror game also made by Lucasfilms. A year later though, in 1988, Simon's Quest came to America. Other than that though, not much happened, except the first Splatterhouse came out in arcades, I guess. In 1999, the notorious Friday the 13th game came out at least. I mean, it was bad, but it came out. But it's okay guys, don't worry, another Castlevania game came out. Konami was putting out so many of these Castlevania games, I mean, they're never gonna stop making them, right? Darn it. Now we're in 1990, it's a new decade, and we are not starting it off very well. Triller made its way to the NES this year, and this was a port of an arcade game. And would you believe it if I said most arcade games refused to buy the arcade cabinet of the original game? In fact, Nintendo didn't even license this game for the NES, instead an unlicensed port of the arcade game was published by HES. In the game though, you win by shooting people in torture devices, and the whole game was just made to create publicity, and I mean yeah, that worked, but once again most arcade games didn't accept the cabinets, so what did you accomplish? Also released that year though was one of Rare's earlier titles, Nightmare on Elm Street, and believe it or not, a movie tie-in made in the early days of gaming was bad. But on good news, the SNES came out that year, and next year we'd get to see our first horror game for it with Super Castlevania. Then, continuing with this whole numbers thing, in 1991, no horror games were released for the Super Nintendo, but there was Splatterhouse 2 for the Sega Genesis, which, believe it or not, was a sequel to Splatterhouse. Other than that though, there was Wolfenstein 3D. I'm not really too sure it makes this a horror game. I guess Nazis are monsters, but still. Also, Night Trap was released this year, and oh look at that, we have age ratings on our games. So I guess I have to play Bully instead of GTA now. Thanks, Sega. Continuing with Sega, in 1992 we saw Splatterhouse 3, once again on the Sega Genesis. And we also got EA's first time making a horror game with Escape from Monster Manor, which was a first-person shooter for the 3DO. It's not really anything too special. Going back to Sega, they made another horror game for the arcades with Alien 3 The Gun, and in it you use the gun to kill aliens, and if I was to guess, I would say that there are at least 3 aliens. And since it was an arcade game, of course it used light guns, but what if you wanted to play Alien 3 without the gun? And despite the thought that it's humanly impossible, Bit Studios, the same people who made Genocide 2, made a version of the game for the Game Boy, NES, SNES, and Genesis. Instead of a real shooter though, it's a side-scrolling run and gun. And, as it would appear, 1993 wasn't really the year for horror games, because we had 2 games this year, being Zombies Ate My Neighbor, a cult classic shoot-'em-up for the Sega Genesis, and Doom, which, don't get me wrong, we all know how that affected the gaming industry, making anything remotely similar a Doom clone, but that was really it. A year later though, 1994 would see the release of System Shock, which is a pretty popular game, and we also got 2 more Alien games, but not much else. It really seemed like people weren't too interested in the horror genre anymore, because in 1994 and 1993 there wasn't all that much. But 1995 was a gamer year. We got another Castlevania game, this time Castlevania Dracula X, and what a spooky title. Also, the PlayStation and A Good Laugh came out this year, and with it we got Clock Tower for the PS1, Darkseid 2 for the PS1 and Sega Saturn, and how could I forget, Innsmouth no Yakuta, which was the one and only horror game for the spookiest console of them all, the Virtual Boy, also came out this year. And on top of all that, Phantasmagoria came out. I hate that name, but it did come out. And last but not least was Zombie Raid, which was an arcade game. But if you thought that was a lot, in 1996 we had the first Resident Evil game, which is now Capcom's best-selling series. We had Twilight Syndrome, the first game in another horror series. We also had Tecmo's Deception, Invitation to Darkness, which I don't know what this game is, but that's a pretty spooky box art. And finally for the PS1 we had Divide Enemies Within, and everyone's favorite horror game, The House of the Dead, was released for the arcade and Sega Saturn. It really feels like the 5th generation of consoles were the king of horror games, with so many titles coming out every year. Like in 1997 there was Overblood, Moonlight Syndrome, Nightmare Creatures, The Note, Symphony of the Night. And compared to last year that's pretty light, but when compared to the NES era, that's a mouthful. I mean, literally, for the first year of the NES's life, there were no horror games at all. Approaching the end of the decade, in 1998, there were still a lot of horror games, even an arcade game called Chaosy, and just looking at it makes my spine tingle. Yeah, that checks out. There are even some horror game sequels this year, like Clock Tower 2 and Resident Evil 2, and on top of that, this year also had the cult classic Parasite Eve releasing, which was a horror RPG made by Squaresoft, and it would go on to get 2 sequels. And look, I actually own one of these games. Continuing with big name horror games releasing this year like Capcom and Squaresoft, we have Hell Knight by Atlus. It isn't an RPG like what they're known for today, instead it's a first person survival horror game, and would you look at that, Konami helped out with it. On top of all that, there was also Deep Fear, Juggernaut, and Mazorna Falls, which only released in Japan. And finally, at the end of our journey comes 1999. With some amazing games like Castlevania 64. Okay, that's not an amazing game, but we got Silent Hill, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, and Parasite Eve 2. All amazing games. And I would actually own a copy of Resident Evil 3 to show off, but GameStop sent me a broken copy, so isn't that fun? But also in 1998, the Dreamcast came out, which means we got our first survival horror game for it, Blue Stinger and D2. There was also Countdown Vampires, a survival horror game published by Bandai, and also from the makers of Resident Evil came Dino Crisis. And if you thought Dino Crisis was cool, later that year we got Germs, Galarians, The Guardian of Darkness, Nocturne, Shadow Man, Zafsy, and The Soul of the Samurai. That's a pretty big lineup. Horror games are such an interesting genre because it can be hard to make you feel the same type of tension that you would when watching a movie that you would when you're playing a game called Germs. That's why it's so cool to see how horror games evolved from 1982 all the way to the end of horror games in 1999. You see, no horror games were released after 1999, said so on Woodrow Wilson's Wikipedia page. I mean, what are you gonna do? Call the 20th President of the United States a liar? That's what I thought. So, remember to stay safe, and that I love you guys.